Hi, everyone. I'm Rick Barron, your host, and welcome to my podcast, That's Life, I Swear. My guest today is Michael Ashford. Now, Michael is a dynamic communications explorer and marketing executive. Now, he's on a mission to transform the way we connect. Michael sees a world where curiosity sparks deeper conversations. Now, what do I mean by that? Finding the confidence to share your perspective, and where clichés give way to powerful, meaningful stories. Now, let's face it, most of us were never taught the art of how to communicate. But Michael is here to change that. Please join me as I have my conversation with Michael Ashford. Michael, welcome to the show.
Man, Rick, I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. Thanks for having me, sir.
Oh, same as me. I've been following your progress on some of the things you've done with your speeches and your website. And before I get going, I want to call that out to the audience. I will provide Michael's website URL, and please go there. There is a lot of good information there, particularly if you want to connect with him. He's offering workshops and various classes on communications, and just looking at it, I think it's well worth you paying a visit. So I have to say that because I was really impressed with what I saw there.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, you're very welcome. Now, before we get started, maybe you could just kind of give a broad brushstroke, if you will, of who you are and where you are today.
Sure. Well, I was born on a hot summer day in 19 now. I'll start with the fact that I'm a former journalist, and yet while I'm not a practicing professional journalist these days, Rick, I still consider myself to be an independent journalist of some sort. That's where my training was. That's the degree I graduated college from, excuse me. And that mindset, that mentality of not the kind of journalist that you see on cable news. I don't really consider those to be journalists. Those are entertainers. I'm talking about, the local journalist who covers a community, who lives in that community that he or she is tasked with covering, and just the curious nature, the storytelling nature with which they approach their work. That's how I got my start professionally, and I weave that into a lot of the communication work that I do now. Certainly, a lot of the work that I do as a marketing director, as you mentioned. While I'm no longer a practicing professional journalist, I still hold true to a lot of those tenets that I grew up in my younger career practicing and implementing. So from there, it's just, how do you look at the world through the eyes of a journalist in bringing a level of curiosity to your interactions with other people? I think is an interesting take on the world, or at least I think it is.
Well, I know from the outset here, when I introduced you, I covered the fact that you say that the way we communicate, we didn't learn it very well through communication, and that it is kind of lacking in that perspective.
Yeah.
But also, as you just called out, how we dip into our curiosity. So there's two schools of thought there. What do you see as lacking in the education world that doesn't help an individual get a grasp of what good communication is? And then the curiosity factor. So I think those are two schools of thought that I think would be very insightful for people to understand.
Yeah, and I think they're closely paralleled.
Okay.
I think they're woven together. And so let me see if I can be a quilter or a crocheter and knit these things together here for you. So if you think back to your formal education, and anybody listening, think back to your school days. How were you taught? What were you taught? And how were you measured on whether or not you knew that information or not? Well, it was somebody stood up in front of the room, and sure, maybe in kindergarten there was a little bit of experiential learning. You're maybe sitting down on a mat listening to the teacher read, but all the focus is directed towards this one individual, or should be. And they are teaching you in terms of communication, spelling, grammar, phonics, those core tenets, those base foundational elements of communication. How do you spell this word? How do you say this word? How do you build a word, build a sentence, make it grammatically correct? And as you go throughout your schooling, it's more of the same. It evolves into, in high school, you're writing essays, and maybe you're doing persuasive writing, and maybe you're creating a what's the word? A research paper where you have to prove a point. Maybe you're on a debate team, or like I was a mock trial member at my high school. So we were fake lawyers arguing fake cases in fake court. And then you get into college and it's expository writing classes. And maybe you have to take a psychology degree or a psychology class as an electorate, but all of it is centered around this one person giving you the answers that then later tests you on your ability to recall and retain that information. I'd characterize it like this, Rick. It is all about how certain you are about what you've been taught. There is little to no room for deviation from the quote unquote right answer, even when it comes to communication. And my position is, how could that possibly be true for things like emotions and empathy and curiosity and all the things that are what a lot of people would be labeled soft skills that can't be tested, that don't have a right answer, that are incredibly nuanced? Mm-hmm. If you think about curiosity, then in that scenario where the teacher has the right answer and you're going to be tested on it, and there's a yes, no binary right, wrong answer on that test to what you're being quizzed on, where does it make sense for the student, the person learning, to insert their curiosity and question what they're being taught? It rarely happens. It rarely happens. Unless perhaps you took some journalism classes, you took some interviewing classes, maybe you wanted to be a therapist and you got deeper into the world of psychology. Then some of that nuance and complexity was brought in, and I'm sure there are many other degrees, right? But that's what I mean. We were very much taught the exertion of communication. How do I exert the right answer onto someone else? And we miss the other half of communication here, Rick, the extraction. How do I pull out from somebody? How do I wade into the waters of uncertainty and unknown with my curiosity to question that thing? Even things like math and science. People say those are fundamental truths. The core tenet of the scientific process is to question what you believe to be true. Otherwise, we'd still all be walking around thinking that, the earth is flat. I know there are people out there who believe the earth is flat. But anyway, I think I've made my point here in that we were very much taught a binary way of thinking about all things, including communication, and it left little to no room for true curiosity and exploring the nuance of the human experience, especially when it comes to communication.
So you shared with me early on, we had a conversation that you went to Kansas State and you majored in engineering, and then you jumped over to mass communication and journalism.
Yeah.
Now, what you just described to me, are those the tenets you learned as you were taking the courses there at Kansas, or was it after you left the education environment and went out into the real world, so to speak, that you started to learn, wait a minute, there's more to this than what I was taught, and the real world is giving me an education on how to communicate, how to dig deeper, how to ask those questions that are just a tad more probing, to kind of peel back the skin of the onion, so to speak, to get to the root of what this conversation entails?
It's a little of both. I had professors in my journalism classes at Kansas State, one in particular. I'll never forget him. I love the guy to death. His name is Fred Brock. He no longer teaches at Kansas State. I believe he lives in Arizona. And he was my interviewing professor. I had to take a class on how to interview. And he one day brought in an old tape deck of some of his old tapes. cassette tapes, for those of you who do not remember cassette tapes. And he popped one of them in and he's like, I'm going to play with you an interview with a man who deeply challenged me in my interviewing skills and my ability to listen curiously without judgment or assumption. It was an interview with a man named Fred Phelps. I don't know if that name rings a bell for anybody, but Fred Phelps is the pastor of the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas. I actually believe he's since passed, but they're the people that are standing out in front of soldiers' funerals with the horrible, hateful signs like "You're going to hell," "God hates you," things like that. Those are the people, and unfortunately, those are the people from my home state. He was interviewing Fred Brock. My professor was interviewing Fred Phelps, this man. And he's like, I want you to hear just how this interview goes. And in the course of him playing us that recorded interview on those cassette tapes, what you heard my professor do is he would ask a question of Fred Phelps, and Fred Phelps would give the standard kind of cliche answer, the one that didn't get too much into the weeds of the crazy that was clearly living behind the eyes and behind the mouth. So my professor would he would keep asking just follow-up questions. Well, why do you believe that? Or what's been true that you believe that? How did you come to that decision? He just kept digging a little bit with completely unassuming, non-weaponized questions. And eventually, those questions, I'll use this phrasing, they broke Fred Phelps. You heard the crazy. You heard the crazy come out. He couldn't not answer in the diatribe that he had lived out very publicly all his life. And I was just fascinated by my professor's ability in that moment to just ask the short, simple, sweet follow-up questions that got to an albeit uncomfortable understanding of this man, but just how keeping at it and following that curiosity got you to the root. That was really impactful for me, Rick, to hear that in that moment. Now, when I was a practicing journalist, I had many moments of those myself, including some all-time flub-ups where I asked horrible questions that, were some of my most embarrassing moments were the questions that I asked that that got me nowhere or embarrassed me in front of other reporters. But I really wanted to use the example of my professor, Fred Brock, I really wanted to get better at interviewing. And in getting better at interviewing, I realized that whether I was an actual practicing journalist or not, asking questions is an unlock to the human experience that so few of us practice daily.
That's a good point.
That's been that path for me.
So if you could go back to or even just to the education world, and these have been very insightful answers, hopefully to my probing questions.
Yeah.
How would you redesign communication to be taught to students, even in high school? I mean, for me, when I was in high school, I did, the debate team. I did the written essays, and I felt like, hey, I did pretty good. But, as I got, into later in life, and I started learning things about people and discovering how to speak with people. And I'll mention someone later on. You and I talked about this person.
Yeah.
What is it that people should get an understanding? And I know what you've been taught, but you really might want to take a look at it from this perspective. How would you kind of redesign it, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, our education system is a big thing to try and tackle and think about. And I fully understand the burden and pressure teachers are on to test. A lot of funding is tied up in test scores. I fully understand that and get that. I would love to see more teachers find ways to make space in their classrooms for those nuanced questions where their students can challenge the material in a safe way. one of the questions I would love teachers to start asking, or to encourage their students to start asking more, is, and this is a question for all of us, what could I be missing? If you can ask that question in terms of, even the way we look at historical events cannot be described as 2020 vision, Rick. Like we look at it through the lens of thinking, since we're years in the future, we have this understanding of historical events. But all of that, if you read through textbooks, is so minute in terms of what we understand and the complexity that exists around those things. If you just started asking in your history class around the why Abraham Lincoln declared the Emancipation Proclamation. When I read the book Team of Rivals on Abraham Lincoln and how he assembled his cabinet of all the people he defeated as the presidential candidate and the decisions that they came to, you will understand that this Abraham Lincoln's decision to free the slaves was not entirely a moral judgment. And I'll leave it at that, because I want people to go find their own, or like go and read that book, go and do their own explanation. But by asking that question, what am I missing? You open up and unlock different possibilities, different questions that might come out of it, different questions that beget questions that beget questions, that you then begin to have a fuller understanding of somebody's lived experience, of how events came to be, of why the things that we're taught are what we're being taught. Like all of this stuff, even in math and science, if math and science teachers would allow space for that question to be asked, what could I be missing here when we're teaching what we consider to be fundamental truths, capital T truths? I think we would have an opportunity for us to explore with more nuance the human experience that is incredibly complex and nuanced in and of itself.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I think it kind of goes back to where I read somewhere, I think it was in one of your past presentations, that you have a dislike for cliche type questions.
Yeah.
And and I think you've kind of covered that, but I think for the benefit of the audience, could we maybe just dig a little bit deeper into that? I mean, what's a typical cliche question, if you will? And why does it, for lack of a better word, why does it rub you the wrong way?
Well, I'll say cliches in general, I think dilute the human experience. We use them as throwaway lines to get to some point that we're trying to set up. And this is most often the case when I'm working with speakers as their speaking coach, or in writing, or even as a marketing director at a software company where I work. I tell my team, like, that's cliche. We're not going to throw that out there. That's easily cliched language is easily dismissed by the human eye, by the human ear, and it doesn't mean anything to us. Cliched questions, then, I don't know that there are many cliched questions. I'll say that there are certainly weaponized questions that can come off as cliches, or we can turn questions into weapons that beget cliches or beget stereotypes. So when you're disagreeing with somebody politically and you say something to the effect of, and let's just use an example, immigration, right? If a Republican is matched up with a Democrat, and the Democrat is saying, I don't support these immigration laws that are being passed right now. Well, the Republican might say, oh, so you just believe anybody and everybody should be able to come across the border and enter our country no matter what they do, right? That's what you believe, right? Well, Rick, technically that's a question, but it begets a cliched answer, because that person now immediately feels defensive. They feel attacked, and they're just going to give the high level cliche answer to hit back, to punch back. So it's better than sending people to concentration camps like you want, right? And so we just get into these arguments of cliches and stereotypes when we weaponize the questions rather than asking questions like, what could I be missing? Please tell me how you came to that view of the world. I want to understand, because I think I disagree with you here, but I want to understand I know what I'm disagreeing about before we go any further in this conversation. Like that right there, Rick, even just that pause to say, I think I disagree with you, but I want to know more about what you believe so that I can make sure we're disagreeing accurately. That will beget a story, a non-cliched answer, an experience of someone's life that cannot be summed up in a stereotype. Am I making sense here?
Yeah. I mean, no, I can identify with that because, again, earlier on, we had a conversation and, for the benefit of this person's privacy, I'll use a different name.
Yeah.
My neighbor who lives behind me, Tom, he's moved into this house that used to belong to his parents. And I had no idea that his parents had passed away. I just kind of noticed that the landscape was changing in the front yard. And so anyway, long story short, it got to a point where I needed to replace my back fence. And what we do here in California is that you work with your neighbors saying, hey, look, I want to put in this new fence. Can you meet me halfway? And we'll cover, you take half, I'll take half. And usually it works out that way. And I never knew Tom. So I walked around the block, knocked on the door, and he has this screen door that even when you open the door, you can barely make out the person you're talking to. It's like, I think you're there, but I can hear your voice. Anyway, we started talking. I explained to him, look, I just want to put in a new fence. Could you meet me halfway? He says, well, I'm kind of on a fixed budget. And I really can't afford it. And I didn't say like, oh, come on, man. I left it at that.
Yeah.
And I just happened to notice he had a veteran's flag flying up on his flagpole in the front yard. And he was a little bit kind of abrupt and rough when we were talking. But when I called out the veteran's flag, I said, you know what? I'm a veteran too. I served during Vietnam. The tone of the conversation changed dramatically. He actually opened the screen door and came out, and he shook my hand and he said, I thank you for your service. I said, well, back at you, Tom. And we just started to talk a little bit more. And he said, I wish I could help you. I said, don't worry about it. I'll cover the costs, and I'll have a new fence. You have a new fence. That's the way I was looking at it.
Yeah.
Later on, when COVID hit, he came around to our street to join a gathering of people just to kind of get out of the house and just talk amongst themselves. And, Tom has kind of a rough exterior. So, we have this instant, I'm sizing this person up. Just by the looks of that person, I don't want to talk with them. But I knew Tom. So I kind of motioned him over, and he came, and we started to talk. And we started talking about how he got into the house, his term in the service. And then, he made mention of his political affiliation. So we both had different outlooks on who he favored and who I favored. But to your point, I just started asking him, there are things I hear what this person's saying, and I can agree with, but why do you agree with this premise about what they're saying about this particular topic? And he would give a good answer. I said, well, let's go a little bit deeper. He went deeper with me. And as we started to talk, we just started to develop a very good discussion. And he said, you know what? I got to tell you something. He said, you're the first person in this neighborhood who's ever taken the time to want to talk with me. And I said, come on, Tom. You've been over there on the other side of the street for at least a year. I said, I know. That's my point.
Yeah.
And he said, talking to you, I don't feel like I'm invisible anymore. And I said, whoa. I didn't say that out loud, but in my mind, I'm thinking, and to your point, as you ask more probing questions, you begin to realize there's an individual under that facade. Okay, they may have a rough appearance, but they're a human being. And I think if we all take the time to ask those questions and just, try to be careful how you craft them without, upsetting the person, I think they'll understand okay, at least this person is willing to hear me out. You may not like what I say, but we're talking. So I think that's where, for me, learning how to communicate with people, asking questions, asking more probing questions, if you will, is something that takes time to build, but then you start learning how to go further with someone else who's completely different in asking the questions. So I think there's a lot to be said when you convey that people need to get away from the typical, ABC type questions and just kind of say, wait a minute, I don't know Tom from Adam, but he's willing to sit down and talk to me. I almost felt like here's someone who wants to spend time. So I'm going to give this person the benefit of the doubt. And today we're the best of friends. We don't see each other a lot, but we can sometimes we yell at each other over the neighborhood to say, "Hey, how you doing? Did you watch that football game?" that never happened before. Yeah. So I think what you've been saying over the past 15, 20 minutes carries a lot of weight.
Man, Rick, if we can teach that, if we can teach the story of Rick and Tom in our schools, you're hitting on everything that I try to get across to folks. Like, let's dive into what you did there. A few things. One, it was face to face. You didn't stick a note on his door saying, "Hey, I'm trying to replace the fence. It costs this much. Can you pay? Can you help me pay?" Like, you went up to him. Mm-hmm. You tried to have that conversation face to face. Many of our conversations these days do not happen face to face, and I understand for the reasons why. I'm not a not a Pollyanna here. Secondly, you started out with finding common ground, that veterans flag, or, hey, we're all in this COVID thing together. Can we come to our block and just sit around socially distanced and have some real human conversation here?
Really?
You started there, common ground, finding common ground on, and the things that we agree on first, rather than always looking for the things that we disagree on first. That's second. Third, trust. So many of these tough conversations about things we deeply care about, we forget that to have any sort of impact or to be able to speak into someone's life where they're willing to hear it, if trust has not been built, your message will not resonate. Your message will fall flat. It will feel attacking. It will feel like you are trying to get that person to change, to force that person to change. You built trust by asking questions, by saying, you know what? Let's go a little bit deeper. Man, I love that story so much. This is the second time I've heard it, but it's even better this time just because you gave me more detail there, man. I'm just curious, like, if at any point in those conversations, did you feel the pull to like disagree with Tom? To really like, you know what? That's a stupid answer, or like, that's a stupid way of looking. Did you feel that pull?
I felt it, but I thought if I do that, then it would have made Tom feel like, okay, you're not who I thought you were.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there were times when I didn't agree with some of the feedback, but I would say, you know what? Let me tell you why I don't agree with what your individual's saying. So that way he could get my side of the story. And one time when we were talking, he said, I never thought about it that way.
Oh, I love it.
So it's one of those things where with the back and forth dialogue that I saw Tom is he's an individual. He's a human being. He's not someone that needs to be extinct. We all come from different paths in our lives. We've all encountered triumphs and tragedies, and everyone's going to have a different reaction because perhaps of the environment that they were placed in. So I think what you were just saying, the word truth, unless you can express that sincerity that, hey, I'm sitting here, I'm listening, but please, I hope you'll listen to me as well. Yeah. So it goes both ways. It goes both ways.
It's one of those things where that what you just said reminds me of a story that I put in my book to kind of encapsulate that what you just said, the two different experiences that we can have and how on the surface they can seem and appear really similar. So there was a gentleman that I interviewed for my book and on my podcast. His name is Corey Yeager. Now, Corey and I both grew up in small towns in Kansas. I grew up in Bonner Springs, Kansas. He grew up in Arkansas City, Kansas. And yes, that is the correct pronunciation of Arkansas. He grew up in Arkansas City. I had family in a town very nearby Arkansas City in a town called Independence, Kansas. I would spend summers down in Independence, Kansas, and I would go to the city park where there was an old steam locomotive that was in the middle of the park that was no longer in use, that the kids would run around and play on and be the conductor and get to play on this huge, massive black steam locomotive. There's also a steam locomotive in the town square park in Arkansas City, Kansas, where Doc grew up. He would play on the big steam locomotive there. If you're from the Midwest, like small towns are real proud of our steam locomotives for some reason. And we put them in our city parks. So we have these childhood experiences of going to these small town Kansas parks and playing on these steam locomotives. Here's the big difference, Rick. I grew up in Kansas. I'm a white upper middle class guy in the suburbs of Kansas City. Doc, as he goes by, Corey Yeager, is a black man in small town Kansas. His family is the only black family in town at the time that he was growing up. Now, how do you think his and my experiences differ, even though we both have that same understanding and experience of going to those small town parks and playing on those locomotives? Just not that they might be all that different, but could they have been? And is that something that I can explore inside my head? Like, if I had this experience of the world, how might Doc, as a member of the only black family in Arkansas City, Kansas, growing up, playing on that steam locomotive in that park, how might he have experienced the world differently? And the other kids and the other relationships that he had growing up? It's just one of those things where, yeah, on the surface, those two experiences seem and look really similar. But then you start to dig and get under the surface and start to understand the actual lived experience where, God, you can come into some truths that are absolutely truths. They're just for different people.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point. I mean, you could just reverse that too. What if you were the only white person in your community?
Yep.
So you reverse the roles. Now, you mentioned your book, and it's called Can I Ask a Question, which I think is very appropriate for what we're talking about. How did you come about writing that book? What was the impetus to get that started?
So I have given a couple TEDx talks. I should back up. I started my podcast at the time. My podcast now is called Rethinking Communication. I started my podcast in the summer of 2020 as a response to all the upheaval that we were going through, the riots after the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, of course, COVID, the presidential election between Trump and Biden. I was sitting down watching the news with my wife each night and being like, what is going on? Like, I don't feel like this is who we are, but look at this stuff that we're going through. That's when I started my podcast called The Follow-Up Question. And out of those interviews that I did, because I wanted to see if there was a way that I could explore how might we be able to find common ground, the thing that I found, Rick, was that doing the thing that I had been doing, asking questions of people, non-weaponized, in curious-minded questions, was the way for us to find common ground. Go figure. That led to a couple TEDx talks on the subject that then beget the book. And actually, if you go and watch my two TEDx talks, the very first one I gave is actually sort of the first chapter of the book. And the second one is the last chapter of the book. And I fill in the gaps and expand on those ideas from my talks in the bulky middle part of the book. But it came from those conversations and just the learnings that I started to extract, the commonalities and themes that I was hearing in those interviews that led to, hey, here's some radically different ways of thinking about conflict, communication, and change, and how we mold all those together. That's where the book came from.
Okay. Now, speaking of questions, I know, again, your website had a lot of good information, but the one that caught me was 15 questions to ask yourself to reveal your talk's hidden potential. I pulled it down. And they're all very interesting questions. Now, are these the real gems that perhaps you've picked up over time that you've been doing these courses and workshops, or are there more, but this seems to be the list, like, this is a good start, go with this list? How did you pull this together?
Yeah, these are the good starting point questions. Because Rick, one thing that I think we're also not taught to do well in school, in our education, even just growing up, is to question our own beliefs. And not even question our own beliefs, because that might feel dangerous to our tribe or to our family or to our upbringing or our roots, but to even just explore how we came to our beliefs, the things that we know to be true, quote unquote, in our lives. Have we given thought to how those things took root inside of our mind? It's a very rare thing for us to question things like my political affiliation. The first time I ever voiced my political affiliation, was it truly me? Or was it a conglomeration of my parents and my grandparents and the people that were influential in my life, my pastor, teachers, things like that, right? Religious affiliation, things like that. The way I view what is right and wrong economically. How did I come to those beliefs? What do I think is true? And are those beliefs mine through study, through experience, or am I pulling in aspects of things that I just adopted unconsciously? Those questions are intended to help people, as they think about a talk, get out of the clichés that we talked about earlier. Because if you can bring the true fullness of your experience and what you know to be true, or what you believe about the world and your idea that you want to share from a stage or on a podcast, I think you need to start with some really deep introspective work about what you believe, how you came to those beliefs, and why it matters to you now. We often just say, hey, I believe this thing, I should go and talk about it. Or I believe this thing, I should post on social media about it. And we forget there's a whole world of experience behind that we're not trained to explore really well. And so those questions are hopefully teeing you up to explore those ideas in a deeper way.
Got it. No, it's very interesting. Thanks for elaborating on that.
Yeah.
No, but I think to your point too, when we look where we are today with our country, and maybe in various parts of the world, I think that, social media, as you were saying, words to the effect that, today's newscasters are more entertainers than just giving you the facts. And I think after a while, people's heads are spinning. Like, what do I believe? If I go here, I get an opinion. If I go over here, I get a completely different opinion to the same question. So how do I navigate this sea of anger, if you will? Because people are they're shouting over each other. And I think perhaps people kind of reach this pinnacle, like, what? I just don't care anymore. And I think people do care, but I think they're kind of at a loss for how do we, get through this moment in our time that we're experiencing. I think we're going to get through it, but I think for the most part, it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah.
I know I was watching a newscast, and they had several people from both sides of the fence, Republican and Democrats, and they broke them into separate rooms. and it was like groups of 4. And then about an hour later, they all came back, and they were all talking about the same questions. So when they came back into the room, the one thing that really resonated with me was like, wow, was people were saying, when I walked into that room, I didn't like this person just because I knew right away they were a Democrat.
Yeah.
That was the first thing. He said, but now that we've had this discussion and we dug deeper into what we were thinking, saying, whatever, I now understand this person better, and I look at them completely differently. And I feel like, why can't we do this in real life? Why does it have to be, go to your staging rooms and go through these questions and come back? It's like, we can do this.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, people are holding back, saying, well, let's see what happens. So, I didn't vote for this. And it's like, well, there's fault on both sides of the fence here. But I think we all need to get a handle of ourselves and realize if we're going to get through this, and I think to the point of this conversation, is have a conversation and hear, give, and take, and understand that if we're going to make this, there has to be some give and take, but we have to do it constructively, not destructively.
Yeah. First thing I would say, Rick, is it's not a fence, because a fence has 2 sides. It's a tic-tac-toe board. and you might be right there in the middle, but you might have connections to all other points on the dot in terms of your thinking. But you may be out in the upper right-hand corner, but you still have connection points to 3 other places on that tic-tac-toe board. Like, it is rare that there is ever an issue that is a yes, no, right, wrong, binary, either or. It's a false duality of choice that we are presented with each and every day. That every side has, that there's 2 sides to the fence, and you either got to be over here or over here, and the 2 cannot cross over that fence at all. I love that we're bringing it back to your your neighbor Tom, and you're speaking over the fence here. So it's not that false duality of choice. Something that a woman I deeply admire, she wrote a book called I Never Thought of It That Way. Her name is Monica Guzman. I've had her on my podcast a couple times. Something that she said in her TEDx talk is one of my favorite lines, favorite quotes ever, really. People who are underrepresented in your life will be overrepresented in your mind.
I like that.
Sit with that for a second and think of the ramifications of what that means. We can build up these enemies, these monsters in our head, if our circle is so tightly wound that the only people in that circle are those who think, act, believe, look, and experience the world like us, and everyone outside of that circle becomes dangerous. If you don't have someone in your life who you can go and disagree with and have those conversations like those people in that room, your circle is too small. And I know it will feel morally dangerous. I know it will feel, you will have righteous indignation over whether or not you should give these people the oxygen. Here's a little solace in that. There was a study done where people from, I'll say, both sides of the abortion issue, pro-choice, pro-life, women were brought into a room and they were asked to just have a conversation about what you believe, why you believe it, what you support, what you don't support. Have those conversations. In that study, they found that the people who came out of that room were actually more firmly held to their beliefs than when they went in. The difference, Rick, is what you just described with those people in that room that you described. They came out of the room no longer seeing them as enemies, as monsters. They understood their point of view. They didn't agree with it. Mm-hmm. Even in some instances, they disagreed with it even more, but they understood them and they were willing to work on the messy middle ground of collaboration, of cooperation, to think maybe there are more solutions than just this yes-no binary choice that we've been given. And isn't that how actual real world relationships work?
Well, interesting, because that brings up a question. I mean, what do most people get wrong about communicating during disagreements? I mean, what?
That they have to communicate in such a way to get that person to change their mind.
Okay.
This is an idea I've been exploring lately. We so often, because we have this certainty mindset and because we've been taught in school to exert your idea on people, push it onto them until they either acquiesce and say, you're right, you're amazing, I believe what you believe, or they run away and say, I'm never talking to you again. Either way, you get to plant your flag in the ground as the champion and the victor of that conversation. We go in with this mentality that we have to change them in that moment. You don't have control to do that. You do not have the authority in most instances to do that. What you do have control and a little bit of influence over is to get them to change their perspective of the world or the issue by sharing what you know and by asking questions of what they believe to be true and what they've experienced. Only then can you have perspective change, and that is completely within your control. But changing them, changing their mind, changing their actions, changing their belief, you don't have the power or authority to do that. Yet we go into these conversations trying in an instant to change someone's mind.
That kind of goes to what we're seeing today, where a lot of federal workers are being let go. And in the process, what I'm seeing and hearing is, oh, I had no idea this division did the following. Because at first I thought, okay, we need to, and I think there are various places in the government that need to be looked at, and there's, there's too much, waste, if you will.
Yeah.
But for some of these departments that have been eliminated, and then to get an understanding of not knowing what they were doing before, I feel like, in part, this is probably where we went wrong. To have people understand, you may not like what you see as just bloated government, but as we have been growing over time, there are reasons why we need to have these group of individuals. And you know what? We didn't do a very good job of communicating what they do, why they do it, and how they do it. Because when I saw some of the departments that were being let go, or some people being just completely eliminated, I thought, okay, I can see a little bit of that, but this, wow, I think we went a little overboard on that. And I think that's part of what, besides talking amongst ourselves, I think, how we communicate to make people understand, you may not like what they do here, but unbeknownst to you, because of what they do, you don't have the following problems. It's like you don't see it, but there's someone behind that green curtain.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I have several friends and colleagues in the nonprofit space who do international aid work, and the freezing of funding for USAID has really affected them. And yeah, I look at some of the programs that our funding is supporting here in the United States, and I say, man, that $13 billion sure could build a lot of housing for the unhoused here in the United States, or it sure could feed a lot of hungry children here in the United States, or make our schools better here in the United States. And I look at that and I can make, as still a right-leaning guy, I can make this judgment, surface level, albeit, of, yeah, I look at the titles of those programs and what they're serving and say, yeah, sure, I would prefer to bring that money in-house, so to speak, into the United States. But then I have this experience of having these colleagues and friends who are supporting work in the in sub-Saharan Africa, who are in the global South, who are affected deeply by these cuts and the work that they're doing. And I look at the results that they're getting, and they're explaining to me that, Michael, here's how us doing this work in this country actually is benefiting companies in the United States. And with just me headline reading and then tapping into my my bias for scaling down the government, wanting to cut government bloat and waste. It's this understanding of, to bring it back to what we first started with, Rick, what could I be missing? And if I don't have somebody in my network, like I just said, who I can go and say, you know what, I think I support these, but I know you work in this area. Tell me what you're experiencing so I can understand more. I would never have known that. If I'm just a headline reader, if I'm just listening to the people in my sphere, my little bubble, my little echo chamber, I don't know that. And yeah, maybe I'm still supportive of some of those things, but maybe I switch or change my perspective. In that perspective change, and I'm shifting a little bit. I'm asking for a more nuanced or complex approach to these cuts. It's just, nothing is that black and white, man. It just isn't.
I know. Disagreements can be emotionally draining. So,
oh yeah,
how do you advise someone to maintain their resilience while trying to work through that conflict? What could you suggest?
Commit to protecting the relationship first.
Ah.
If you're if you go in with the goal of being the winner, of being right, of being the one that changes that person's mind, then you don't care how you get the job done, right? But if you go in with the goal of, look, this relationship means more to me than being right in this moment, or being the victor of this conversation, or getting them to change. If this relationship means more to me, if the human interaction means more to me, then yeah, I can get emotional, but not so much that it becomes detrimental to the conversation. Look, we humans experience, I want to say they've cataloged like 256 different human emotions. Go look up the human emotion wheel. Go Google that. It's fascinating. There are like 9 core emotions, but then all of these emotions that we feel underneath. So when we say that we're angry, are we feeling betrayed? Or are we feeling embarrassed? Like, those are 2 very different emotions, but they all fall under this top level emotion of anger. If we can have a sense for that, if we can protect the relationship and introduce the emotion that we all as messy human beings have, it never gets out of hand in the ways that it gets out of hand on social media or on these stupid cable television shows where they only place 2 people who disagree with each other and they're never allowed to ask questions of each other. It's just who can shout louder than the other. Like, I hate it. I hate it.
No, I've seen a lot of those. I mean, it's almost like this discussion is pointless.
It's completely pointless.
So you mentioned you've done 2 TED Talks.
Yeah.
Were you invited? Did you say, I want to put in my name? How do I get, what's the process to get qualified to do something like this? How did that all begin?
Yeah, once I was running my podcast, like I said, and I started seeing these themes, I'm like, I think I've got an idea here, and I want a bigger platform to share this on than just my podcast. I know, I'll do a TEDx talk. A little bit of bravado and narcissism, I guess, wrapped up in that. But I started looking for TEDx events in my area. I saw that TEDx Manitou Springs was getting ready to host its first ever event. I connected with the organizer and founder, Mickey Gates, on LinkedIn. I said, Mickey, I've got an idea that I would love to share on your stage. I know you're not accepting applications for speakers yet, but when you do, just know that I'm really excited about applying. She and I just messaged back and forth. She started asking me a little bit about what my idea was, and she said, okay, I'll let you know. I'll let you know when applications open. Well, about a week before applications open, I get an email or a LinkedIn message saying, hey, we haven't opened applications yet, but here's the link. Why don't you go ahead and apply? And I was like, okay, I see what's happening here. And so I applied and was selected as actually I delivered the first talk of the first ever event that we held. We actually just held our 7th, where I'm now the curator and head speaker coach of TEDx Manitou Springs.
Oh, wow.
It was our largest event ever. Absolutely gorgeous, beautiful space. people from all over the world live streaming in. It was 6 speakers, phenomenal event. I can't wait for their talks to come out. But from that one, I was invited back about a year and a half later to give a second one because somebody liked me out there. So,
So in the time that you've been, excuse me, in journalism and communicating, setting up this website, doing 2 TED Talks, in that journey from when you started to where you are today, what have you learned about yourself? I mean, what have you discovered that you didn't think you had? Or, wow, there was a moment there in this journey that because this happened, I learned something that I didn't think I had inside me. What might that be?
Oh man, Rick, I love this question so much. You know, being willing to question your upbringing, your beliefs, the things you know to be true is really deeply uncomfortable work. And I've learned that I'm able to do it and that it's not so scary, that it's not a betrayal of my family or my faith or the people I love most. And I'm okay with that. There was a guest on my show who told me that the moment you realize that every perspective is biased, limited, and therefore incomplete is the day you realize that you have to follow your curiosity about everything, because that biased, limited, incomplete perspective is your own as well. You do not have the answer to everything. Mm-hmm. and being willing to sit with the discomfort of questioning the things that you quote unquote know to be true. I've learned that I'm able to do it. And I've learned that a lot of people are able to do it. In fact, I believe that everyone is able to do it. And it's not a scary thing, as deeply uncomfortable and dangerous at times as it might feel. Everyone is capable of doing it.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. I mean, it kind of goes back to my walking around the street to meet Tom.
Yeah.
I didn't know what to expect. And honestly, when he opened the door and I could just hear his voice, because the screen door was just the screen itself was very heavy. It was very dense, that I felt like maybe this guy doesn't even want to talk to me. Mm-hmm. But like I said, the moment, I called out the veterans flag and let him know that I was a veteran, I was just astonished how that changed the conversation. Yeah. I guess because, there was a connection there. It's almost like, okay, he's me. I think I can talk to this person. And we did eventually. And I think that's part of what I would invite people to listen to your podcast, because I listened to several of them. And then go to your website to find out the various workshops and the classes that you offer. Because I just, through this conversation with you, in about an hour, I've learned so much about what I can do and do better. But, to your point, I think the first start, I think for everyone, is to not just ask a question, ask questions and kind of just start peeling the onion of that skin. Try it, because, you're going to be surprised, but you're probably going to learn that you never would have thought had you not taken that approach.
Yeah.
Sure, there's that sense of fear, like, okay, if I ask this one more question, is that going to get this person upset? Yes and no, but maybe it's the way how you phrase it.
Exactly.
So just take it in small steps. So we've covered a lot of ground here. I could talk to you for another hour.
Same.
I swear.
I get fired up about this stuff, if you couldn't tell.
No. I believe it. But if there was, and this is probably very difficult to do, but if you were to tell someone, if there's anything I would like to have you walk away from with this conversation, what might that be?
2 questions. Well, let me back up. one of my favorite quotes is by Viktor Frankl. I don't know the exact quote, but he talks about between stimulus and response is that space where there's a pause, where we get to choose in that moment what our response is. When we are stimulated by something, when we feel all 250 plus of those emotions in one moment, when we hear something we disagree with, when we hear something that makes us sad, angry, upset, betrayed, all those emotions, there's that stimulus and there is that response that we have control over. And the only thing that we have control over is how we respond, what we respond to, and our thoughts, our actions, the things that we actually do with that. And there's a space, there's a gap in there that if we took just a little bit more time to ask ourselves 2 questions, I think that our responses would be more helpful in generating the outcomes that we desire. May not be immediate, but the outcomes we desire. And those 2 questions are, and I mentioned one of them, what could I be missing? The second one is, what's my goal? If you just ask those 2 questions when you feel stimulated before you respond, that response will be more helpful and actually drive the outcome in the long term that you want.
Yeah,
I would say then on the flip side, to add one more question to it, because I love questions. If you just started conversations rather than from a place of disagreement, but trying to understand the person first, and again, protect that relationship, if you could ask the question, what do you care about most? You open up a world that would previously have been behind a locked door to you. And maybe they don't come out and fully engage you, just like Tom, but then you can say, I'm actually really interested in learning more about you. I'm curious to know what you've experienced. Please tell me more. Just like you asked Tom, hey, can we go deeper? People love talking about themselves, Rick, and they're gonna talk. You just got to give them the space to unlock that door and let you in.
Oh, I know. That's the good invite, isn't it? No, but I'm reading a book right now by David Brooks, and in the book fold there's a caption that calls out what the book is, and I'll quote it here. And the book entitled is about the ability to see someone else deeply and make them feel seen, to accurately know another person, to let them feel valued, heard, and understood. Now, I picked up that book after we had our first conversation, because when I saw the title and then the book flap, I thought, this kind of goes along with what I think you're all about, to get to know people. Don't make them feel like, well, I could just tell what you're like just by looking at you.
Yep.
How can you say that? You don't even know what this person has been through in their lives, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. Maybe if you open up, they would say, oh, okay, you look very slick, but you're really a down-to-earth person. I had no idea. We all have these immediate, senses of sizing people up immediately, because we've all been tarnished with various biases, like, oh, okay, we know what that person's like. No, you don't. You just don't.
Yep.
But listen, Michael, I want to thank you for the generosity of your time. I really found this conversation very insightful, very informative, I got to tell you. And again, I want to tell the audience, please go visit Michael's website. I'll provide the URL in my show notes. And I think you'll find it's well worth your trip, because I think you're going to learn a lot from Michael. So Michael, again, thank you very, very much.
Rick, thank you so much for creating the space for us to have this conversation. I appreciate it, sir.
You're very welcome, sir. So everyone, that concludes this episode, and I thank you for coming in. So we'll be seeing you again, and you take care.